Ladies and gentlemen, I want to take the time before we start this episode to thank you for the growth on the last few videos. It's amazing to see that there is some interest indeed in these little episodes that I'm doing. Apologies if I sound off today. I've not been very well all day, so just trying to manage. For some reason my broadcast isn't showing. There we go. In today's episode we continue the read-through of SAS The Great Train Raid, the most daring SAS mission of World War II by Damian Lewis. Today we're going to read a few more chapters and do a bit of a reflection on each. So, I suppose we just dive into it. My name is Alfie, and this is Before Dracula, World War II, the SAS. Chapter 3, Slapstick. The knife-cut prow of the USS Boise cut through the Mediterranean calm, her passage throwing up barely a plume of spray as she cleaved the waters. With her twin-raked funnels and multiple 6-inch gun turrets, normally the light cruiser would strike a decidedly graceful, if warlike note, but right now her classic lines were rather all cluttered and befuddled. For items of kit, entire vehicles even, were strapped to every inch available of deck space, including some of the most unlikely of places. Some 150 of Bill Sterling's SAS were crammed aboard a warship that was hardly designed as a troop carrier, not to mention as much of their kit as she could handle. Their jeeps had been slung in odd places all over the ship, and were even lashed to the tops of the gun turrets. It meant that the Boise would be seriously hampered if she were called upon to fight, for with her crowded decks her guns could hardly be brought to bear. In a calculated risk taken by the Allied commanders, she was but one of several warships similarly encumbered, forming an invasion fleet that was steaming north of the Tunisian point of Bizerte, aiming to hit southern Italian shores. Typically their deployment had been a horrendously hurried, last-minute affair. Fully 5 SAS squadrons had been ordered to move, and they'd spent all night packing kit and weaponry. While everyone understood they were heading for Italy, no one knew the exact reason or nature of their mission. It had all been chaotic and very hush-hush, so much so that some of the official records for the time would even get the key names wrong. Posted with 2nd SAS Regiment Bizerte in USS Bogey. Read 1. Somewhat fittingly, this cobbled-together deployment had been codenamed Operation Slapstick. The one major bonus about riding aboard the USS Boise was proved to be food. Compared to what the SAS were used to, the American rations were the best. Many had not tasted fresh-baked bread for weeks. Most stopped wondering about their destination or the nature of their mission as soon as the call went out over the ship's tannoy system. "Come on, you limeys, come and get your ice cream and cookies." Limey was common American slang for Brits, the name originating in the practice of Royal Navy ships' crews being given a daily lime juice ration to prevent scurvy, a disease caused by a lack of vitamin C. The SAS shared the wider convoy with the men of the 1st Airborne Division, a British unit that had seen little previous action, officially some 12,000 strong. The division was markedly under strength, having suffered casualties in recent days during the invasion of Sicily. Deploying at such short notice, no aircraft were available to fly them in, hence their means of conveyance. So cramped were the ships that only half the division was present in this first wave, and there was room for very few guns and practically no transport. Typically the men only had a day's rations, plus the ammunition they could carry on their person. They would have to rely on improvisation, requisitioning local vehicles, and capturing enemy equipment and weaponry. In truth, their mission was in direct response to a momentous development in the course of the war. For those present knew anything Few of those present knew anything about this, or had any idea how such warships could possibly land troops as theirs on hostile shores. Nothing made a great deal of sense, at least not until they heard the startling news over the loudspeakers that Italy had surrendered. After a few seconds of stunned silence, a tremendous cheer swept through the ships of the decks of the ship. Whoops. To all present, it felt as if their efforts to gain victory in North Africa had paid off, and that part of the debt of Dunkirk had been wiped out. As the ship's bar was declared open, all went to celebrate, and to drink to comrades who could not be with us, and to those who would never drink again, as one of the SAS men observed. Coming some 48 hours into their journey, and the announcement filled with all the tremendous excitement and triggered a great wave of speculative rumour. Further news followed. The Italian naval fleet had supposedly come over to the Allied side, and part of the Taranto and the port of Taranto was being cleared for the Allies. Shortly there was concrete evidence of this, as a flotilla of Italian warships steamed past the invasion fleet, bound for Malta, where their formal surrender would be taken. Still, the American vessels, and one British ship in their number, the minesweeper, HMS Abdiel, did their best to keep their guns trained on erstwhile enemies, at least until they were well out of range. That done, the USS Boise steamed towards Italian shores. No one knew if the Taranto landings would be opposed, or whether German troops still occupied the port city. Only time would tell. Further announcements made clear just what was expected of the invasion forces. Situated on the heel of the Italian boot, Taranto was one of the foremost naval bases in Italy. Many of the Italian warships had steamed past, hailed from there. In their wake, the US-British invasion fleet was to steal into Taranto itself, to seize the port and its naval installations, which were to be held at all costs. This was the prize which supposedly justified all the rush and confusion of the present deployment. The men of 2nd SAS doubtless the most battle experience of those present, had landed a role which thought it might provoke resentment and frustration was bound to put them in the thick of the action. Of course, in theory, there should be little Italian resistance, but the forces of the German 1st Parachute Division, long experienced and battle-hardened, were known to be on the ground. Word was that they'd strung a cordon of steel around the port city itself. The prize of Taranto would lure the Allied forces in, and then the trap would be sprung. Once the invasion troops got ashore, they would be the only Allied forces holding the entire heel of Italy, and very thinly spread. Bearing in mind the stakes involved at the odds, it would have been churlish for the men of the SAS not to get into the swing of things. Charged to act as the eyes and ears of the division, their role was to face far ahead, rooting out and fixing the enemy. There was one major problem with such a mission. Apart from its unsuitability, as with their airborne brethren, the SAS were woefully short of vehicles. Of the 5 squadrons, only one had a full complement of jeeps. Of the remainder, they either had few or none, so would have to seize whatever transport they might find. It was a beautiful day as the USS Boise approached landfall. To either side, tiny red-roofed villages clustered along the azure shoreline, making Taranto look more European and more like home than anything we'd seen in North Africa. One of the SAS commanders observed. Deeply suspicious of the Italians' intentions, their supposed surrender and the handling over of such a prize, the escort destroyers steamed ahead of the main fleet, guns at the ready as they hustled towards the harbour. Ashore, there was movement. The SAS studied it through their binoculars. We saw German tanks and trucks moving along the promenade, observed one. We feared the worst. The leading warship, a destroyer, raced ahead and opened fire. Those crowded aboard the Boise threw themselves down on the decks, expecting the cruiser to follow suit with her 6-inch guns. "Clear the decks for action," came the cry over the ship's speakers. Not that there was exactly anywhere for the SAS to go. Crawling behind the nearest cover, they saw the Boise's 5 triple guns, turret swings, around to menace the shore, but instead of hearing the deafening blast of shells tearing overhead, there echoed across the water a series of explosions. To the experienced ears of the men of the SAS, it sounded as if the enemy might be blowing up ammo dumps in preparation for leaving. They took that as a positive sign. Shortly, the Boise moved cautiously along the line of buoys that marked the route to the docks, passing a fleet of Italian tugs, the crews of which eyed the men aboard the American warship with the same curiosity with which we regarded them. By now, the waterfront seemed utterly deserted of civilians. Taranto itself looked like a ghost town. The inhabitants, fully expecting a massive naval bombardment, had fled into the hills. A few Italian sailors lined the docks, studying the newcomers uncertainly. One indicated where the USS Boise should tie up. The ship's captain, not fancying the look of that berth, opted to choose an adjacent one. It was to prove a fateful decision. Shortly, HMS Abdiel, the British mine layer, slipped into the space that Boise had rejected. And launched in April 1940, the Abdiel had scored a string of successes, at one stage laying a minefield that had sunk the Italian destroyer Carlo Mirabello, the gunboat Pellegrino Metachusi, plus the German transports Keipfels and Marburg, which were carrying a large contingent of the second Panzer Division to Taranto. Unbeknown to her captain, the Abdiel was about to face a similar fate. Mines had been planted in that very berth by a departing German naval crew. 2 exploded beneath the heavily laden mine layer, which sank within 3 minutes, claiming scores of lives, with 150 or more injured. Apart from the ship's crew, most of the dead were airborne troops which she was carrying. In one fell swoop, the ranks of the 6th Royal Welch Parachute Battalion had been devastated, so much so for the so-called surrender and ceasefire, for the Italians looked to have been complicit in the attack. It was first blood to the enemy, and a very lucky escape for the USS Boise and the men she carried. To many of the SAS, the Abdiel's grim fate underlined the duplicity and the treachery that all would now have to guard against. As one of them, Corporal Albert Charlie Hackney, a long-standing SAS veteran, would note, as they watched the unfolding disaster from the deck of the Boise, they were convinced that an Italian torpedo bomber had pounced on the Abdiel, the aircrew of which either did not know of the Italian surrender or chose to ignore it. Who knew where the truth lay? Where were they heading? Who would be able to tell friend from foe? Hackney just hoped that the firepower and versatility of their US-made Willys Jeeps would lend them an edge. The combination of twin Vickers machine guns, Browning 50 cal machine guns, Bren guns, personal weapons. The Tommy gun was the most favoured submachine gun at the time. Grenades and explosives offered colossal firepower to the armed Jeeps. But as they prepared to unload the first of those 4x4s from the Boise, it was glaring obviously how few they were in number. One sweep of the docks revealed a dearth of usable vehicles, with the city's inhabitants having fled. Tamale had been emptied of its transport, while the Boise, having docked, scramble nets were tossed over the side, and figures began to swarm ashore. Foremost among them was SAS Lieutenant Alastair McGregor and his 5 men. His stick of 6 having been given a vital objective, they were to execute a dash to secure the dock gates. As the Boise had cruised north along the Mediterranean, McGregor and his men had studied their maps and memorised the route that lay ahead. Now as they swung down the ship's side, each man had an M1 carbine or a Tommy gun slung over his shoulder, 6 grenades and a fighting knife and a pistol stuck in his belt, plus a bulging rucksack strapped on his back. If the scramble had been down the side of a full-master, remarked one, and we were carrying knives in our mouths, we could have been transported to Hollywood as Captain Kidd and his boys. In other words, the notorious Scottish pirate and his crew. Ever since volunteering for the SAS together, McGregor's patrol had worked as one. They'd learned each other's good points, our faults, and we learned to trust each other. This was one of the standout facets of Bill Sterling's second-day SAS. He encouraged commanders to pick and choose their own teams, valuing close bonds that would be forged. The Captain Kidd comparison had been made by Trooper George Arnold, who was especially close to the man they all knew simply as the boss, Lieutenant McGregor. Before volunteering for the SAS, Arnold and McGregor had been serving in North Africa and had executed a night assault against a dug-in German machine gun, the site of a feared Spandau, a rapid-firing MG-42 machine gun known as Hitler's buzzsaw, due to its fearsome noise. It had cut down several of McGregor's men. Under cover of darkness, he and Arnold had belly crawled up to it, grenades gripped in either hand with the pins removed. Striking by complete surprise, they'd lobbed the grenades before finishing off the MG-42 crew at close quarters. Lieutenant McGregor had just turned 25 as they'd sailed for Italy. He'd been educated at Epsom College, a top private school on the outskirts of London. There he'd excelled at the kind of gentleman's pursuits that suited his combative, adventurous nature. Boxing, fencing, shooting and rugby. Signing up to the military at the outbreak of the war, he fought with the British Expeditionary Force in the defence of France before weathering a hazardous evacuation from Dunkirk. He'd gone on to see service in North Africa, but after an altercation with the authorities at battalion headquarters, he'd been ordered back to Britain. McGregor, it seemed, had other ideas. He was damned if he was going to miss out on the Italian landings. Instead, he jumped off a train en route to the port, made contact with Bill Sterling's 2nd SAS, and was promptly invited to join them. Married in 1942 to Magda, a Hungarian, the stocky gruff an impetuous-seeming SAS lieutenant was actually blessed with fine battle instinct and considerable charm. He brought most of his regulars into the SAS with him, urging Arnold and several others to volunteer. Devilishly handsome as he would be described, McGregor was known to be a charismatic and determined leader, one who had the confidence to allow his men to have their say. That side of his nature, his inclusive spirit, had made of men like Arnold utterly loyal and dedicated recruits. Arnold, 2 years McGregor's senior, was likewise married to Nellie. They had one infant son, John, but in contrast to the SAS lieutenant, Arnold hailed from a very different background. He'd left school, Higham Elementary in Norwich, at age 14, to work as a shoemaker for the family needed the money. In fact, Arnold had precious little family to speak of. His father, Edward, a soldier, had been brought up in an orphan's home, but he had been killed in the First World War. Arnold never got to know him. Worse still, his mother Eleanor had abandoned him, after which Arnold had been cared for by his grandmother, Mrs. E. Webster. 2 years after leaving, he'd enlisted as a boy soldier, going on to join a cavalry regiment and deploying for North Africa as part of an armoured unit. It was there that he'd come under the command of McGregor and experienced at first hand the horrors of war, as their armoured vehicles had got shot up by the Germans' fearsome 88mm anti-tank guns. Seeing his comrades reduced to corpses, their bloated bodies full of hungry flies in the burning sun. When war broke out, Arnold had been in India, patrolling the rugged northwest frontier province on horseback. Assessed as being a good rider but too hasty to be a good horseman, his military record was littered with infractions: absent without leave, neglecting to obey orders, rank insubordination, breaking out of camp, and more. Repeatedly he had pay docked, been confined to barracks, reprimanded, or otherwise disciplined. That was until July 1943, when he joined the SAS. There he'd found his true home, this was a unit whose only disciplinary measure was to be returned to unit. In other words, expelled from the exalted fraternity, the Brotherhood. In Arnold's case, as with so many, this was all the discipline that he seemed to need: self-discipline. At 5'5" tall and weighing just 119 pounds, the diminutive Arnold was known as Blondie to all, due to his shock of wild, sandy hair. There was one problem with the scramble nets flung down the USS Boise's side. They stopped 10 feet short of the harbour wall. Not great, when, like Arnold, you were one of the shortest men in the unit. But having spent weeks during training flinging themselves off of scaffolding towers, or even moving vehicles, in an effort to prepare themselves for executing a parachute jump for real, disembarking from the Boise should be child's play. Dropping the last 10 feet, McGregor and his men picked themselves up and glanced around, as it looked as if the whole place was deserted. Moving silently on their rubber-soled boots, they began to head along the route they had memorized. Take the first turn left, then take the first turn left again. Past 3 buildings, then turn right, and the gates will be about 50 yards in front. Evening was settling over the city, the shadows lengthening as they traced their path, weapons at the ready. They rounded the final bend, but my God, in front of us was a machine gun pointing at us. Before the dock gates, a gun crew were gathered around their weapon. The central figure had it gripped by the handles and looked as if his fingers were on the trigger. Just a few months back, Arnold and McGregor had stalked that MG-42 post, but then at least they'd been cloaked in darkness. Now it was light enough to see and to aim, to shoot to kill. Diving into cover of the nearest building, McGregor and his men levelled their weapons, but they were under strict orders not to shoot unless fired upon. Those figures manning the machine gun could well be Italians, who in theory were now their newfound allies. McGregor and his men lay shock still, studying their adversaries. The machine gun crew did exactly the same, just there, staring at us, as Arnold observed. Stalemate. Each side was wondering what to do. Finally, McGregor turned around to Arnold and said, "Okay, Blondie, Swill, follow me. Let's see how close we can get. The rest of you, cover us. If there's any sign of movement, open fire." Trooper Swill Sutton had volunteered for the SAS alongside McGregor and Arnold. Rising to their feet, the trio set off. Moving closer to the machine gun, the gaping barrel of which was pointed directly at them. It was like walking the gallows, as Arnold noted, all tensed up, fingers itching on triggers. They got to him within 20 metres when the man directly behind the weapon rose to his feet. He just stood there, shock-still, staring at the 3 SAS men, not speaking or seeming to move a muscle. They expected him to raise his hand in surrender, but not a bit of it. Another of the gun crew got to his feet and did likewise. McGregor, Arnold and Sutton crept closer until they were within spitting distance of the machine gun. Still no one had said a damn word. Suddenly, the figure nearest McGregor had made a move. He must have recognised their uniforms, for he flung his arms around the SAS lieutenant, crying out in Italian, "Buongiorno! Viva gli inglesi! Viva gli inglesi!" Before any of the SAS trio could think how to react, the other 2 Italians had embraced Arnold and Swill, and were likewise crying out their greetings. We did not know what to expect, except return the gesture, observed a somewhat nonplussed Arnold. Once they disentangled themselves from the Italians' embraces, McGregor gestured for the soldiers to unload their gun, at which point they dissolved into laughter. They indicated that McGregor should inspect it. It turned out not to be loaded, and neither did the Italians have any ammunition. It had all been an absurd piece of theatre, just in case McGregor and his men were Germans, and McGregor indicated that the Italians should head it for the Allied ships lying at berth, where they could get fed and processed. Meanwhile, he and his men stepped towards the dock gates, which were locked and bolted. An old man emerged from a nearby hut, jabbering away and brandishing some keys. He was obviously the gatekeeper. He proceeded to unlock the gates and swing them wide. McGregor led his men through. Inside there was a crowd of silent, terrified-looking civilians. They eyed the newcomers as if they were lepers, shrinking back from their presence. Then, from the crowd, emerged a figure who looked as if he'd just stepped out of a comic-era opera. Dressed in gleaming riding boots, breeches, and a blue tunic that was adorned with more gold than the Bank of England. His get-up was topped off by an enormous tricorn hat. Recognising McGregor and his men as British troops, the Carabinieri officer, a commander of the Italian paramilitary police, began to explain in English how the people of Taranto welcomed the Allies and how they would do all in their power to get rid of the hated Tedeschi, for no Italians wanted this war. Tedeschi was Italian for Germans. In response, McGregor told the Carabinieri to order the townsfolk to go home and stay there. There could be fighting on the streets, and they had to remain inside. With the docks secured, McGregor had led his men across a bridge that connected the port area to the main city. Next objective was the railway station. They reached Taranto's main square, utterly deserted, not a light showed anywhere. The silence could almost be felt, Arnold observed. A shot rang out, a bullet ploughed into the wall not so far from him. Search as they might, they could not locate the gunman. They moved on to the railway yard. The gates were locked, so they vaulted over the perimeter wall. The entire place seemed eerily devoid in life. Ghostly. A train was lying in the station abandoned. Its carriages proved to be chock full of foodstuffs, mortar shells, plus a Mercedes vehicle. Moving up the railway tracks, McGregor and his men spied some blazing truck headlights coming down the road. As was a convoy. Dashing for cover, they took up firing positions, forming a snap ambush. Arnold had dived into a ditch where he readied his Bren light machine gun, a favourite of British troops. Though it had less than half the rate of fire of the MG42, the German equivalent weapon, the Bren was far more accurate and could even be used as a sniping weapon. As he lay in that ditch preparing to open fire, the sickening smell filled Arnold's nostrils. It seemed to be coming from right beneath him. He had no time to worry about it then. The seconds ticked down before McGregor gave a yell, "Hold your fire!" Arnold could not believe his eyes. McGregor stepped into the road. He began to move towards the leading truck with one hand raised in the stop position and his pistol levelled at the windscreen. The convoy was racing towards him and it looked as if he was going to get run over or gunned down. "Halt, Inglesi!" It worked. The convoy ground to a sudden stop. The lead driver jumped from his cab and moments later he was giving McGregor the same kind of treatment as his comrades had at the dock gates. This was an Italian military convoy, and the soldiers were seeking to surrender. They had deserted from the Germans, and the trucks were full of food and ammunition. Getting to his feet, Arnold was struck by that sickening smell again. He glanced down. A human hand was sticking out of the earth. He bent and scraped some soil away, and there was the face of a dead woman. I must have had the legs of the Bren on her chest. He spoke to some of the Italians and showed them what he'd found. They offered to exhume the body and put it in one of the trucks and drive it to Taranto for proper burial. That sorted, McGregor urged his men on. They reached a vantage point which overlooked the railway. McGregor told his men to each choose an olive tree that offered good cover, and in pairs they'd take a break for a brew. While one made two, the other would be on watch, and they just started doing so when Trooper Dello gave a low hiss of his alarm. Dello, a Jew hailing from London's Soho district, was blessed with an unbelievably wicked sense of humour, but he wasn't joking now. With a famous weakness for nuts, he'd eat anything that came out of a shell. He'd been about to tuck into his own private stash when he'd spied movement. "Look towards the railway line," he whispered. Figures were darting through the half-light, flitting over the railway embankment through the trees. Arnold alerted McGregor, who'd taken cover perched in the branches of nearby trees. From his vantage point, the SAS lieutenant could see that they were German troops. He opened fire with his Tommy machine gun, the blazing muzzle flash lighting up the branches all around him in dramatic silhouette. This was the signal for all to do likewise. Arnold let rip with his Bren, the accurate fire from which cut down two of the distant figures. More enemy soldiers rose from the cover of the embankment, and Arnold fired again. It was at the limit of the accurate range of the Tommy guns, but not the Bren. Two more fell, but whether they were just ducking for cover, Arnold didn't know. While their fire was delaying the enemy, McGregor expected them to launch an attack at any moment, opting to stay where they were in good cover. They resolved to fight it out. Movement would only risk drawing the enemy's fire, for they'd have to cross open ground in either direction. McGregor and his men hunkered down. The enemy were closing in. Trap set. Excuse me. Well, that's talking about Operation Slapstick, which, as we detail and see in that book, was obviously quite a secret part of this whole major operation in the invasion of Europe. And as it states, it was so secret, in fact, that even some of the records, which, as we covered in the last episode, weren't released until 1968, which was over 27 years from the founding of the SAS. Obviously, what we see here is, again, more accounts from each of the soldiers that were involved in this operation, and it's so far it's an absolute brilliant read, I think. Obviously, I'm struggling a bit more today with pronunciation, but that's because I'm not very well, and I'm trying to do this podcast as quickly as I can so I can go to sleep, which is why I've done it earlier than normal. Back at the USS Boise, the last of the SA vehicles... Chapter 4, which is Ambush Alley. Back at the USS Boise, the last of the SAS vehicles had been unloaded and readied for battle as they sought to secure Tamale from the enemy. First to nose cautiously into the darkening city were the jeeps were the men of the D Squadron, SAS commanded by the redoubtable Major Roy Farron. As with the missing Pickney and Appleyard, Farron was another of Bill Sterling's earliest and most prized recruits. The city felt hot and oppressive. The dusk streets were thick with silence. The air's sticky humidity stirred here, and there was only a faint sea breeze. Farron, a long-term veteran of the war in North Africa, was no stranger to such conditions. As Corporal Hackney would remark, the SAS commander's track record spoke volumes. Major Farron, originally a cavalry officer, had been wounded and captured in the battle for Crete, but had escaped from a POW camp. Wounded again, and in the retreat to the Alamein line. He later fetched up in Algeria. One day he bumped into an old friend who organised an interview for Farron with the CO, Bill Sterling. Brought into the SAS to lead D Squadron, Farron was to prove an outstanding commander, but in truth, he only had made it into the SAS by the skin of his teeth. In his second episode of being wounded in battle, Farron had been hit in a Luftwaffe dive bombing attack during the 1942 to El Alamein. Shot in the arm, he'd lost the use of two of his middle fingers and was slated to be invalided out of the military. Evacuated to a South African hospital, he'd managed to bribe a nurse with a bottle of gin and a bunch of flowers, and absconded from the ward to spend his time lounging by a pool and chasing after the ladies. Many of us only avoided marriage by a narrow margin in these happy days, he would remark of his South African interlude, while others fell by the wayside, having refused surgery since there was nothing I could do except play the piano, which I'd never learned anyway. Farron was dispatched to Britain to go before the medical board to assess his injuries. Somehow he managed to convince them to upgrade him to Category A, fighting fit. Pulling strings with one or two generals, Farron got himself back into the war. Posted to a regular unit, he'd been branded as an untrusted upstart. With his medals, he'd been awarded an MC for his heroism on Crete, plus a bar for his epic escape, and his unconventional military mindset. After his North African experiences, Farron was a die-hard believer in the need to threaten the security of the enemy's lines of communication, those vital lifelines without which an army cannot exist, plus the need for long-range harassing attacks made by small raiding parties, possibly independent of the main theatre of operations. Ostracised within the unit to which he'd been posted, he'd been welcomed with open arms into Bill Sterling's 2nd SAS. From the very first, Farron recognised the battle-winning potential of their jeeps, the ideal vehicle for this type of warfare. They had a tremendous load-carrying capacity, enormous range, and a fine cross-country performance, and a great firepower. Farron's D squadron was lucky enough to have a full complete complement of the vehicles, the only one to do so. That put him and his men at the very tip of the spear. There was an uncanny air about our silent advance up that deserted highway. Farron would later write, as the column of jeeps nosed north through the darkening city, apart from having a vague smattering of intelligence that the German 1st Parachute Division was somewhere up ahead, Farron and his men knew nothing, with no friendly forces either side. He felt half proud to be the advance guard of a new army in foreign soil, half afraid of the unknown. The route north into Taranto took the form of a wide, tree-lined boulevard. Farron's jeep was second in line of march. His deputy, 22-year-old Lieutenant James Big Jim Mackey, taking point. The column-like moon shadows of the trees punctuated the highway, each marking their onwards passage, only the faint growl of the jeep's engines disturbing their deathly silence. The SAS Maxim was good reconnaissance is done by the eyes in the daylight and by the ears at night. Frequently, Mackey brought the entire convoy to a standstill, as he stopped to execute a listening watch, straining his ears for the slightest sound, and with all senses on high alert. Still, there seemed to not be a snip of any hostile presence. Mackey, a tall, sandy-haired fellow hailing from Edinburgh, would be the first to hit any trouble. For a man who had never harboured an evil thought in his life, as Farron would describe him, Big Jim was eager to be the first into fight. With a father who was a professor of bacteriology and the dean of medicine at Edinburgh University, Mackey had been keen to follow in his father's footsteps. But he'd been obliged to put aside his medical studies and go to war, loyal to a fault. When Mackey stopped and beckoned Farron silently forward, the SAS major did as he was bid. Mackey indicated a number of armed figures just visible in the gloom, clustered around a key bridge. As Farron and Mackey studied them, trying to identify who they might be, a voice cried out a challenge in Italian. It looked as if these were Italian troops, so the SAS's supposed allies. Inglesi, Farron yells back. British troops coming through. Alone. He started the long walk. As he did, he remarked to the Sergeant Major Bill Mitchell, one of the gunners on his jeep, to cover him with a Bren light machine gun. Farron approached the bridge, which was occupied by a group of shadowy figures in indistinct green uniforms. Suddenly, one rushed towards him, rifle raised, and fired around at almost point-blank range. Miraculously, it failed to hit home, instead passing clean between Farron's legs the instant the shot was fired. Mitchell opened up and peppered the gunman with a whole magazine of Bren bullets. The standoff ended when each side managed to identify the other. The gallant defenders on the bridge were indeed Italians. Their officer produced a bottle of wine, and after profound apologies on both sides, the case of mistaken identity was cleared up. Drinking a somewhat forced toast to their new alliance, British with Italians, the dead sentry lay ignored and unmourned, crumpled in the dust, an innocent victim of an accident of war. Having garnered what little intelligence he could, Farron got the convoy underway again, pushing north out of the city. A little way further along the night-dark highway, Mackey became unsure of the route. He pulled to a stop. In his halting Italian, asked a figure at the roadside for directions. The response he got from this was an unintelligible snort, and with a punch to his chest the one-word answer, Tedesco. None the wiser, Mackey turned to Corporal Clark, the most well-educated fellow on his vehicle. Corporal Clark, what does Tedesco mean? Clark stared with mouth agape for an instant, before swivelling his weapon around and yelling out, Germans! The soldier was indeed German, and seeming resigned to his fate, he muttered a subdued, Ach so. as he was made to climb into the back of the jeep to be taken prisoner. 4 more German soldiers were captured in this way, before the quiet of the night was torn apart by a sustained burst of fire, tracer rounds streaking through the darkness and ricocheting all around the leading jeeps. The gunfire had the signature tattoo of the Schmeiser, the German machine pistol MP40, the submachine gun that was favoured by many of the SAS, Farron included, whenever they could get their hands on one. In the chaos and confusion, the Vickers K guns, perhaps the best machine gun in the world for quick retaliation, more than proved their worths. As Farron and his men pumped magazine after magazine of tracer into the darkness, they managed to break off the contact without taking any casualties. In the process, one of their prisoners had bolted, but then Farron had discovered exactly what he needed to know. The position up ahead, Massafra, a town lying some 25 kilometres north of Taranto harbour, was well and truly occupied by the Tedeschi. Farron's response was simple. He steered around the convoy of jeeps left down a side road in an effort to box around the enemy. At first light, they decided they reached the tiny village of Poggiano. After a night spent on the move and under intense stress and strain, they grabbed a few hours' precious kip in the shadows of the cactus hedges that line the streets. By mid-morning, orders had come through to push further north, so as to infiltrate well to the rear of the German positions. The jeeps inched ahead for a dozen kilometres before they reached a crossroads. Bizarrely, an Italian policeman was there standing traffic duty, seeming to be one of the good Italians whose sympathies lie with the Allies. He informed Farron that of the roads thereabouts were crammed with German vehicles, most of which were heading to their base at Genosa, to the northwest of Toronto. As feared, the enemy were pouring troops into the area to stem the Allied offensive, which meant that this was as good a place to any to try stopping them. Farron directed his men into hidden ambush positions. The last jeep was busy backing into some trees when the SAS commander spied a large convoy approaching the crossroads. Throwing himself into the cover of a roadside ditch, he readied his Tommy gun, only to open up if and when Farron pulled the trigger. Suspecting the convoy to be Italian, the lead truck was almost upon them before Farron recognised the signal on the driver's cap. They were German troops, all right. The moment he opened fire, the combined force of some 40 Vickers K guns, augmented by the heavy caliber Brownings, let rip, cutting into the German column at practically nil range. The report in the SAS war diary from the time described a successful ambush capturing 2 trucks and 42 men and destroying 10 vehicles. The reality on the ground was far more visceral, as Farron and his raiders hammered in the fire all along the length of the enemy convoy. Rounds tore through thin steel and canvas, shattering glass, puncturing fuel tanks and setting vehicles ablaze. Faced with such a withering attack and hit by utter surprise, the enemy were barely able to mount the slightest response. Just minutes into the ambush, the first of the makeshift pathetic white flags were raised above the vehicles, but the fearsome onslaught, once started, proved far harder to stop. Spying those flags of surrender, Farron began screaming at his men to cease fire. It proved impossible to make himself heard over the cacophony of several dozen assorted Vickers Ks, Brownings, Brens and Tommy guns unleashing hell. His was this decidedly multinational force, for many a non-Brit had been recruited across North Africa into the ranks of the 2nd SAS. Once a Frenchman called Durban unloaded a whole belt of Browning machine gun upon the enemy with tense, excited face, before eventually Farron was able to make himself heard. Finally, the deafening racket stuttered to a stop. In the comparative silence that followed, Farron began to make his way down the line of shot-up burning vehicles in the front ones of which all were now dead. For within the thick pall of smoke, a knot of German troops emerged, waving white flags. They'd taken cover at the convoy's rear, still breathless from the adrenaline rush of the attack. Farron and his men began yelling at them to come forward with their hands up. In response, enemy soldiers got on the move, led by a German officer who was bleeding heavily from an injury and who was crying out for mercy and for him and his troops to stop. Clearly, the enemy had not a shred of resistance left in them. Farron's greatest fear was now some kind of response from Genoa, where German forces were mustering, aware of how his squadron had not sufficient enough strength for a pitched battle. He set about the most urgent priorities. Skeleton crews were put together to man the captured vehicles, valuable prizes, especially since the SAS was short of transport. Once that was done, the crowd of German prisoners were loaded aboard the trucks which set off for Taranto. With that sorted, Farron and his men set about sabotaging any remaining kit before hightailing it south for a good distance. Eventually his convoy of jeeps pulled to a halt, curious as to the enemy's reactions. Farron set upon a ruse. Stopping a local farmer with horse and cart, he persuaded the men to take 2 of his soldiers up the road, up to the crossroads. They would bury themselves in the heap of hay that filled the cart, making sure they got a good sight of the road junction. They returned a while later with a full report. Sure enough, the enemy had sent a heavy contingent of troops riding in armoured vehicles to investigate. Halting at the crossroads, they'd endeavoured to salvage what kit and equipment they could and to bury their dead. They'd done so within an hour of the ambush, which meant that the enemy were proving swift and decisive in their response to any such incidents. Had Farron's squadron lingered after the attack, they would have faced real difficulties, being heavily outgunned and riding in their unarmoured, open-top jeeps. The decision to make theirs a shoot-and-scoot attack had been entirely the right one, Farron's assessment proving tellingly accurate. In other parts of the peninsula, British forces were taking some punishing casualties. Even as Farron and his men had been battling the enemy, so a second SAS squadron had motored out of Taranto, heading into the gathering gloom, or rather, half a squadron, for the remainder possessed no jeeps in which to get on the move. Bill Sterling, second in command, was in charge of A squadron, and he rejoiced in the splendid name of Major Oswald Aloysius Joseph Carey Hughes. That's one hell of a mouthful of a name, wow. As Sterling himself was banned from deploying, he was viewed as being too valuable to risk the cold face of war. Carey Hughes had been dispatched to Taranto to act as his eyes and ears. Sterling had a good reason to send Carey Hughes. Bill and his brother David had been good friends with Carey Hughes at Ampleforth, the celebrated Catholic boarding school where the latter had excelled both at rugby and boxing. More to the point, Carey Hughes was a long-standing career soldier who had compelling reasons to fight. The youngest of 8 children, he'd signed up to the British military in 1933 in memory of his elder brother Wilfred, who'd been killed earlier in action in 1917, aged 18. That same year, 1933, another of his brothers, Columba, had been ordained as a priest at Ampleforth. Hailing from a long line of champagne merchants, Carey Hughes spoke fluent French and was a fierce Francophile, and could act as the perfect Frenchman, which would prove mightily handy for what was coming. Oddly, considering his background, he'd been first dispatched to West Africa to soldier in one of the war's lesser-known conflicts, finally making it to North Africa. He'd jumped at the chance to try for 2nd SAS, being all of 30 years old, a comparative elder in such a unit. He'd thrown himself into the training with a gusto, after which he'd cut his teeth on a series of raids, news of which was carried home to his family by none other than Randolph Churchill, the British Prime Minister's son. A sometime soldier with a sometime journalist, Randolph had been one of the first to report on the exploits of the SAS. Getting word home was important to Carey Hughes, for in 1939 he'd married Pamela Brendan and they had one infant son, Charles. The Carey Hughes family traced their roots back to William the Conqueror, at the time which time the name was spelled Norman Helawisa, or Helavisa, rather, which it also appears as Helvis, and may well have been earlier Viking origin, with Hel meaning big and Vis meaning wisdom. The Hughes clan had since added French and Cornish blood to its lineage, and boasted a string of senior military figures in its line. Coming from a family steeped in tradition, Carey Hughes wore it surprisingly lightly. In fact, there was much of the maverick and the buccaneer about his bearing. The recruitment of Corporal Charlie Hackney to the SAS was in case of point. Having volunteered for special service, Hackney ended up getting deployed to North Africa in 1941, serving in an armoured regiment, the 4th Queen's Own Hussars, with whom he saw a brief but bloody spell of fighting. Promoted to sergeant, he was given command of a Crusader tank, but it was hit in action and set aflame. Discovering that all of his crew had been killed, Hackney bailed out and hid in some scrub before he was picked up by friendly troops. Commanding his 2nd Crusader, he'd again spied an orange-coloured flash of flame up ahead, the signature of a German 88mm gun firing, and his tank was hit. This time his driver was killed instantly, his wireless officer mortally wounded, and his gunner badly injured. Again, Hackney was the only one to escape relatively unscathed. Luckily, a dispatch rider was able to pick him up, while his injured gunner was propped up in great pain in the motorcycle sidecar. On arrival back at their lines, Hackney was ordered to take another Crusader out without delay. He was unshaven, dirty, exhausted from lack of sleep, and his clothes were in tatters. He point-blank refused. Hackney was placed under close arrest and confined to a tent guarded by a pair of soldiers with fixed bayonets. Reflecting upon his dire predicament, he realised he very likely faced a court-martial and might well be shot for cowardice in the face of the enemy. At this juncture, a tall, ramrod straight figure boasting a spectacular moustache appeared, introducing himself as Major Oswald Carey-Hughes. The newcomer inquired of the prisoner why he was under arrest. Hackney explained he also added that he'd volunteered for special air service early in the war, was commando trained, and had taken part in the Operation Claymore, the Lofoten Islands raids. The Major's response was to make an offer to Hackney that he in his right mind would have been foolish to reject. Carey-Hughes explained he'd hailed from a unit called the SAS, one that the prisoner had clearly never heard of. Having outlined a little of what they were about, he told Hackney to be outside with his kit in double quick time if he wanted to be whisked away from a world of trouble. Hackney did as suggested and joined Carey-Hughes, along with 2 other fresh recruits that the Major had garnered. So began a journey of over 1,500 kilometres by jeep, crossing the Great Sand Sea of the Sahara Desert, via the Siwa and Kufra oases to reach the SAS's isolated training camp at Kibrit, Egypt. Upon arrival, Hackney and his fellow recruits were told to pick a tent and fight it out for possession when the 2 occupants returned from the desert. Carey-Hughes advised Hackney that a strict condition of joining the SAS was to lose a rank, so he would have to take down his sergeant's stripes. This Hackney did on the spot, tearing off the relevant insignia. Noting the gesture, Carey-Hughes' good nature seemed to get the better of him. He disappeared, returned with a needle and thread, and told Hackney to sew back on 1 stripe, making him a lance corporal. Hackney's intensive training had only just started when a letter arrived ordering him to be returned to his parent unit to face a court-martial. Believing Hackney was worth more alive than dead, the SAS founders ignored the missive. As far as they were concerned, if the 4th Hussars wanted Hackney so badly, they would come and get him. They never did. Over a year later, in Taranto, Hackney was serving in Roy Farren's D Squadron with Carey-Hughes, his recruiter. While Carey-Hughes, his recruiter, was commanding A Squadron. In the hours after making landfall, Carey-Hughes pushed his jeep some 35 kilometres northwest of the port city, making for the town of Matola. The squadron had taken possession of their vehicles only shortly before departing for Italy. They had been forced to test fire and zero in the gas-operated Vickers K guns during the drive for their SAS camp to the port of Bizerte, using rocks and other desert features as makeshift targets. Even so, when battle was joined, the men of A Squadron shot first and bit hard. The squadron's war diary takes up the story as Major Carey-Hughes' petrol ran into an enemy section just outside of Motala. The SAS proved decisively quicker on the draw. They killed 3 and took 3 prisoners. without suffering casualties. Having broken off contact, a second patrol commanded by Lieutenant Huggett, one of Carrier's deputies, ambushed and attacked an enemy transport column. In the thick of the firefight, a jeep conked out, leading to 3 of Carrier's men being taken captive. As the SAS major concluded, their work here was turning into a stalking match, which is won by the quickest man on the draw. So, that concludes today's reading of the book. And obviously as I said, each chapter sort of details the operations, because I was looking last night and there are not many records publicly available on these operations, and I'm eventually going to have to start sourcing stuff from somebody who knows a great deal more about this sort of thing than me. So stay tuned for that. As I say, thank you so much for the support in the last few episodes. It means a lot to me to know that people are actually out there and listening. Hopefully I should be a bit better by tomorrow, which will be when the 3rd episode of this comes out. Thank you so much for watching. And I've been Alf. This has been Before Dracula, World War II, the SAS. And I'll see you all in the next one. Bye-bye.